So today we will begin chapter 5. The chapter begins with a realistic description. Stephen is preparing for going to the university, and he is going to take his bath, or he is going to wash himself. And so his sisters have been told to prepare his bath, for the water for washing, and they relay the request one to another, thus humorously showing that Stephen had a great number of siblings, and his father is very impatient that Stephen is late. His mother helps him in getting prepared, and then he leaves. So this piece of realistic description of his family life is followed by his thought, and he is of course thinking about the studies, the things that he is studying now at the university: Aristotle, Aquinas, and he thinks about the synopsis of scholastic philosophy by Aquinas. So St. Thomas Aquinas appears to be a great influence on Stephen in the formulation of his aesthetic theory. So this is the final chapter of the novel, and as you know that the novel will end with a formulation of an aesthetic theory, and this is common in the genre Künstlerroman, that is the novel that speaks about the growth of an artist. The artist comes to maturity when he can formulate for himself an aesthetic theory. For Stephen, the scholastic philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas is a great influence, and Stephen follows him, but he does not follow him slavishly. So there are some differences between Stephen's aesthetic theory and that of St. Thomas Aquinas. We will look at that when we look at his aesthetic theory. Today, of course, I don't think we will reach there. Before Stephen can formulate his aesthetic theory, there are a number of discussions with different persons, a number of dialogues with Stephen, between Stephen and the Dean of Arts, between Stephen and Devin, between Stephen and Lynch, his friends. So all these dialogues help the reader to understand Stephen's thought process and where it is leading to, until it reaches the climax of the aesthetic theory. Stephen is also thinking about poetry, and in his mind he imagines a few verses, and this is absolutely miserable poetry. This is not poetry at all. On page 162 of my edition, the ivy whines upon the wall, and whines and twines upon the wall. The ivy whines upon the wall, the yellow ivy on the wall, ivy up the wall. So determinedly, I think deliberately, Joyce makes Stephen here imagine such ludicrous lines, and Stephen himself is critical of these lines. Did anyone ever hear such drivel? Lord Almighty, whoever heard of ivy whining on a wall? Yellow ivy, that was all right. Yellow ivory also. And what about ivory ivy? So even though the verse is not good, but it helps to expose or to reveal Stephen's occupation or preoccupation with language, with words. So in the phrase ivory ivy we see alliteration, and then also another figure of rhetoric. And Stephen thinks about ivory. Now, throughout the novel, we have seen that ivory is an important image, and when Stephen looked at the hands of the girl, the of ivory complexion, he remembers the praise sung to Virgin Mary and Tower of Ivory. This expression. So ivory is a significant color in this novel. Ivory, ivoire, avorio, ebour in different languages. So ivory in English, ivoire in French, avorio in Italian, and ebour in Latin. So Stephen thinks of the word in different languages and then remembers the phrase he learnt in school in Latin textbook. India mittit ebour, that is, India sends ivory, India exports ivory. In this way we see that Stephen goes on thinking, and then he thinks about his friend Devin, and Devin is a peasant's son, so an Irish peasant's son. And when Stephen looks at Devin, he feels contempt for this Irishness and also the low culture. This class of peasants from which Devin comes. So Stephen thinks that he comes from a starving Irish village. Side by side on page 164, side by side with his memory of the deeds of prowess of his uncle Matt Devin, the athlete, the young peasant worshipped the sorrowful legend of Ireland. So Devin's uncle was an athlete, and Stephen thinks of Devin as the young peasant, and he worshipped the Irish myths. Now for Devin, Irish myths are very important, but for Stephen they symbolize lack of intellectual development. So unlike William Butler Yeats, John Synge, and other proponents of Irish nationalism and the revival of Irish culture, Yeats, Joyce was not very proud of the Irish heritage, and in this novel at least we see that Stephen looks down upon Irish culture and heritage as substandard, not only substandard but lowly, because his ancestors or the Irish people bowed down to the British culture and accepted their language and their culture as superior, and therefore Stephen thinks Irish culture to be subservient or of slave-minded. His nurse had taught him Irish and shaped his rude imagination by the broken lights of Irish myth. Stephen is thinking about Devin. He stood towards this myth upon which no individual mind had ever drawn out a line of beauty, and to its unwieldy tales that divided themselves as they moved down the cycles in the same attitude as towards the Roman Catholic religion, the attitude of a dull-witted, loyal serf. So as the Irish people had a slavish attitude towards Roman Catholic religion, in the same way Devin had a slavish attitude towards Irish myths or Irish culture. On the contrary, Stephen thinks that nobody ever added any beauty or any sense of aesthetic appreciation in this Irish culture. Whatsoever of thought or of feeling came to him from England or by way of English culture, his mind stood armed against in obedience to a password. Devin felt a kind of rebellion against English culture. So this is the notion of Irish nationalism, which many young boys of Stephen's class or Stephen's generation felt to be important, but Stephen thinks otherwise. So Devin's ambit of cultural inheritance is very confined, very narrow. So beyond Ireland, in Europe, he could think only of France. And of the world that lay beyond England, he knew only the foreign legion of France in which he spoke of serving. Coupling this ambition with the young man's humour, Stephen had often called him one of the tame geese. So Stephen taunted him by calling him a tame goose. Why? Because he always wanted to serve something, like he either wanted to serve French culture or English culture or was subservient to Irish culture. So he never thought of culture and literature in an independent manner. And there was even a point of irritation in the name pointed against that very reluctance of speech and deed in his friend, which seemed so often to stand between Stephen's mind, eager of speculation, and the hidden ways of Irish life. Hidden ways of Irish life. So Irish life is represented in this novel as something cloistered, something hidden, something concealed, and something which is not to be. Then Devin tells Stephen about a strange experience. And this experience, I tell you in a nutshell, that one day Devin was walking on a lonely road leading to an Irish village, and there, when he was very tired, he knocked at a door, and there, in front of the door, in that hut, there was an Irish woman. And the Irish woman invited him inside and told him that my husband is not at home, he has gone to some town, so I am alone, you can come in. Which means that the Irish woman offered him to have kind of sexual pleasure or to have a time together. And Devin, still a student, so he was taken aback, and he did not accept the invitation, and he left. Now this story has two significances. One is the importance of libido in the process of growth. And Devin, by coming back and not accepting the woman's offer, exposes himself as a timid middle class person, a person with middle class values, unlike Stephen, who had ventured out and tried to have such experience with the prostitutes. So Stephen's psyche is very different from that of Devin. So Devin's psyche is very limited, narrow, and always obedient to all the values imposed upon him, whereas Stephen always rebels against all kinds of imposition. So that is one significance of the story. The other significance, which actually Stephen draws from the story, is that the Irish woman offering himself to a stranger represents some kind of a low culture for the Irish. So Stephen's purpose is to establish this culture of the Irish people, which sometimes is very substandard, and later there are one or two more examples by which Stephen tries to depict this Irishness, which is different from any sophisticated civilized culture. And Stephen calls the Roman Catholic Church of Ireland the scullery maid of Christendom. So among all the Roman Catholic churches in Europe, the Irish Roman Catholic Church had the lowest prestige, and Stephen calls it the scullery maid, that is the maid who washes dishes, the scullery maid of Christendom. So we'll see at this story and how Stephen represents his low esteem for Irish nationalism. So on the one hand, the Irish nationalist movement was raging and young boys were participating in that. On the other hand, Stephen finds that nationalist movement to be not far-sighted, to be very limited in its vision, and refuses to join it. So the bottom of page 165, Devin narrates his story and describes the Irish woman. She was half undressed as if she was going to bed when I knocked, and she had her hair hanging, and I thought by her figure and by something in the look of her eyes that she must be carrying a child. She kept me in talk a long while at the door, and I thought it strange because her breast and her shoulders were bare. She asked me was I tired and would I like to stop the night there. She said she was all alone in the house and that her husband had gone that morning to Queenstown with her sister to see her off. And all the time she was talking, Stevie, she had her eyes fixed on my face and she stood so close to me as I could hear her breathing. Devin called Stephen Stevie. When I handed her back the mug at last, she took my hand to draw me in over the threshold and said, "Come in and stay the night here. You have no call to be frightened. There is no one in it but ourselves." I didn't go in, Stevie. I thanked her and went on my way again, all in a fever. At the first bend of the road I looked back and she was standing at the door. So the woman still standing at the door, that image creates a strong impression upon Stephen. And when Stephen was thinking about this, all these thoughts accumulate in his mind. They do not go away. They form his memory. Later again he comes back to this thought. So as he was thinking about this, then a flower girl, that is a girl who sells flowers, gently touches Stephen on his shoulder and says, gentleman, your own girl, sir, the first hand sale today, gentleman, buy that lovely bunch, will you, gentleman?" So she offers him her flowers and asks him to buy them. Now Stephen has no money, so he says that I have no money, and then the girl at first insists and then says, "Okay, one day you will have," and Stephen says that possibly, he said Stephen, "but I don't think it likely." So it is not likely that I will ever have money, because Stephen is always thinking of rebelling against any kind of authority imposition. So it is unlikely that he would be able to find an employment. So in this also we find the figure of the Irish girl is a figure who is deprived, poor, and begs people for buying her flowers, and that also adds to Stephen's image of Irishness in her mind. There were 4 French delegates in a break, and a plump smiling young man held, wedged on a stick, a card on which were printed the words "Vive l'Irlande," that is, "Live Ireland." So this sign also makes Stephen think of the Irish nationalism, and basically he is deliberating in his mind on this question of Irish nationalism. Then Stephen meets the Dean of Arts. The Dean of Arts is Jesuit father, and he is an Englishman, so a converted Roman Catholic, because Englishmen are mostly Protestants. Now the Dean of Arts was converted to Roman Catholicism and has come to serve here in Ireland from England. So Stephen has a discussion with him over questions of art and language, and we see that the Dean of Studies is not as sharp as Stephen on the question of art, aesthetics and language, and even he did not hear English words or did not know some English word which Stephen knows. So even though he is an Englishman, his knowledge of English is not as good as that of Stephen. So we see here in Stephen, we see an attitude of silent criticism of the Jesuit priest, the English priest. So the priest, the dean of studies, he was making a fire, and their conversation begins on that topic. One moment now, Mr. Dedalus, and you will see there is an art in lighting a fire. We have the liberal arts and we have the useful arts. This is one of the useful arts. So this kind of division of arts as liberal and useful comes down from the age of scholastic education in the Middle Ages. So making a fire is a useful art, not a liberal art. The dean rested back on his hunkers and watched the sticks catch, Stephen to feel the silence. So the dean lights candles, and with that he tries to make the fire. I am sure I could not light a fire, Stephen says. You are an artist, are you not, Mr. Dedalus? Said the dean, glancing up and blinking his pale eyes. The object of the artist is the creation of the beautiful. What the beautiful is another question. So we may say that from here, the issue of aesthetics or the issue of a theory of arts, it starts from here. The discussion about art starts from here, and the dean raises this question, what is beautiful, and says that it is a difficult question to answer. Stephen, of course, immediately answers it by quoting from St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas says, pulchra sunt quae visa placent. So you look at this sentence, Latin sentence, it is very important. I am not writing down, I hope that you have the text with you. Pulchra sunt quae visa placent. Pulchra means beauty, beautiful. Sunt are, quae those, visa the sight, placent please. So this is the translation. So beautiful are those things which please the eye. Pulchra beautiful, visa sight, placent means please, quae those. So those which please the eye are beautiful according to St. Thomas Aquinas. But Stephen will later explain that Aquinas did not mean by visa only sight but all the senses. So those which please the senses, they are beautiful. This fire before us, said the dean, will be pleasing to the eye. Will it therefore be beautiful? Insofar as it is apprehended by the sight, which I suppose means here aesthetic intellection, it will be beautiful. So Stephen further explains sight, visa. So here he says that it means aesthetic intellection. So not only seeing with the eyes but also thinking about it, appreciating it. So aesthetics means the power of appreciating something. So insofar as it pleases our apprehension, our absorption of something by the senses, it is beautiful. But Aquinas also says, bonum est in quod tendit appetitus. Good is that which tends to our appetite. Is the translation clear? Bonum means good, est is, in quod, in which or by which, tendit appetitus, in which appetite is satisfied.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So Stephen says that Aquinas also says that good is that which satisfies our appetite. So appetite means any kind of bodily need which is satisfied. So we desire warmth in winter. So insofar as the fire helps us in getting that warmth and we feel it pleasing, it is good, bonum. But in hell, the fire torments us. Therefore, that is not pleasing. In hell, however, it is an evil. So, this is the difference between good and evil according to Aquinas. So, good is that which helps to satisfy our appetite, but that which does not satisfy us, that is evil. So, the fire in hell is evil. So, you see that how in the scholastic tradition, in the medieval scholastic tradition from which Stephen draws his examples, good and evil are intertwined with the aesthetic question of what is beautiful. Or Stephen brings together Aquinas' ideas on aesthetics and ethics, good and evil. Quite so, said the dean, you have certainly hit the nail on the head. He rose nimbly and went towards the door, set it ajar and said, a draft is said to be a help in these matters. Then Stephen looks at the Jesuit priest and he is very critical. He says that this priest is without imagination. He is slavish. He only follows dictates of others. He follows dictates of religion. Stephen saw the silent, as he came back to the hearth, limping slightly but with a brisk step. Stephen saw the silent soul of a Jesuit look out at him from the pale, loveless eyes. So there is no warmth in his eyes. There is no, expression of love in his eyes. And then Stephen in his imagination compares this priest to Saint Ignatius Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuit order. And Stephen says that this priest is lame because he limps. He is lame like Ignatius Loyola, who was also lame, but he does not have the inspiration like Loyola had. Like Ignatius, he was lame, but in his eyes burned no spark of Ignatius' enthusiasm. Even the legendary craft of the company, a craft subtler and more secret than its fabled books of secret subtle wisdom, had not fired his soul with the energy of apostleship. It seemed as if he used the shifts and lore and cunning of the world as bidden to do for the greater glory of God, without joy in their handling or hatred of that in them which was evil, but turning them with a firm gesture of obedience back upon themselves. And for all this silent service, it seemed as if he loved not all the master and little, if at all, the ends he served. So the Jesuit priest, probably Stephen thought, only serves the dictates of the order. He does not consider, good and evil nature about the orders, or he is not emotionally involved. He does not act out of love or hatred. So he mechanically follows orders, and often those orders may be evil. So at the back of Stephen's mind probably is the idea that Parnell was assassinated by the order of the Roman Catholic priests. So in Ireland, a lot of evil actions were taken by the Roman Catholic priests. So Stephen was brought up in this ambience, and therefore he was very critical of the Roman Catholic priests who followed orders mechanically without considering good and evil. Then the conversation again veers towards aestheticism, and the dean asked him, when may we expect to have something from you on the aesthetic question? From me, said Stephen in astonishment. I stumble on an idea once a fortnight if I am lucky. These questions are very profound, Mr. Dedalus, said the dean. It is like looking down from the cliffs of Moher into the depths. Many go down into the depths and never come up. Only the trained diver can go down into those depths and explore them and come to the surface again. So the dean was speaking metaphorically, and Stephen says, If you mean speculation, sir, said Stephen, I also am sure that there is no such thing as free thinking, inasmuch as all thinking must be bound by its own laws. So this is too deep for the Dean. The Dean won't understand this. Stephen is talking about speculation, about how thoughts cannot be lawless. They are controlled by certain laws of themselves. Stephen says, for my purpose I can work on at present by the light of one or two ideas of Aristotle and Aquinas. So Stephen appears to speak in a very humble manner to the Dean, but actually it is quite clear that he has read too much of Aristotle and Aquinas already, and he knows them by heart much better than the Dean. I quite see your point. I need them only for my own use and guidance until I have done something for myself by their light. If the lamp smokes or smells, I shall try to trim it. If it does not give light enough, I shall sell it and buy another. So Stephen is talking here of a lamp, the image of the lamp, metaphorically. So he means to say that I try to use some idea from Aristotle and Aquinas. He compares that idea to a lamp. So if the lamp is useful, or if it can be trimmed or modified, then I can use it. So if Aristotle or Aquinas' idea can be trimmed or modified, made appropriate for today, then I will use it. But if it cannot be modified, then I do not use it. So Stephen says, I sell the lamp in that case. But the Dean of Arts thinks that Stephen is talking actually about a lamp. So here is a humorous situation where the Dean cannot understand what Stephen was saying, and they speak at cross purposes. So the Dean begins to talk about an actual lamp and says, Epictetus also had a lamp which was sold for a fancy price after his death. It was the lamp he wrote his philosophical dissertations by. You know Epictetus? So by referring to the Greek philosopher Epictetus, the Dean tries to appear scholarly and refers to the lamp of Epictetus. But this is completely out of point here, because Stephen was not discussing any lamp. And of course Stephen knows Epictetus, and he very derisively, sarcastically speaks of Epictetus, an old gentleman who said that the soul is very like a bucket full of water. So Stephen did not think much of Epictetus, though the Dean thinks that he was a great philosopher. And a little later Stephen appears to be very tired with this very mediocre conversation with the Dean, and the imagery which the Dean constantly uses, lamp and bucket, they do not inspire him in the least. A smell of molten tallow came up from the Dean's candle butts and fused itself in Stephen's consciousness with the jingle of the words bucket and lamp, lamp and bucket. So you see, again, a synesthetic experience. The smell of the tallow burning, the jingle of words, that is sound, olfactory, and the visual, of course. So Stephen's mind, halted by instinct, checked by the strange tone and imagery and by the priest's face, which seemed like an unlit lamp or a reflector hung in a false focus. So the priest's face was like an unlit lamp, that is a man who is stupid, who does not understand anything, so who cannot focus on anything. What lay behind it or within it? A dull torpor of the soul, or the dullness of the thundercloud, charged with intellection and capable of the gloom of God. So Stephen is trying to probe what lies in the psyche of the Jesuit priest. So he can see only dullness. But when he speaks to the Dean, he speaks very politely. I meant a different kind of lamp, sir, said Stephen. Undoubtedly, said the Dean. One difficulty, said Stephen, in aesthetic discussion is to know whether words are being used according to the literary tradition or according to the tradition of the marketplace. So in aesthetic discussion, people cannot always use words with their ordinary meaning, the meaning in the marketplace, but often have to use words with a literary meaning or a special meaning. So if two people are talking, if they do not understand each one's meaning, then there is confusion. He gives an example from Newman. I hope I am not detaining you. And he wants to give the example that detain in the prose of Newman, Cardinal Newman, is used in a special sense when he was praising Virgin Mary. But the ordinary meaning of detain is you hold somebody back, the meaning of the marketplace. But the Dean takes the ordinary meaning. When Stephen says, I hope I am not detaining you, he is quoting or he is using this sentence in a special sense. So this sentence is in italics. But the Dean thinks that he is telling him, I hope I am not detaining you, that I am not holding you back. Not in the least, said the Dean politely. No, no, said Stephen, smiling. I mean, yes, yes, I see, said the Dean quickly. I quite catch the point. Detain. So the priest appears to be intelligent, appears to be clever, but he is not. So he does not understand the point at all. So then he comes to imagine that, yes, probably Stephen is talking about the word detain and its different meanings. To return to the lamp, he said, the feeding of it is also a nice problem. The Dean says, you must choose the pure oil and you must be careful when you pour it in, not to overflow it, not to pour in more than the funnel can hold. So the Dean tells him that pouring oil into the lamp is also a difficult task, and you have to use the funnel. Now when he uses the word funnel, Stephen says, what funnel? The funnel through which you pour the oil into your lamp. That, said Stephen. Is that called a funnel? Is it not a tundish? So Stephen is using a word, tundish, which is an English word for funnel, and Stephen says that it is spoken in Lower Drumacondra in Dublin, where the English reside, and they speak the best English there. They use the word tundish, and the priest does not know this word at all, even though he is an Englishman. Is that called a tundish in Ireland? Asked the Dean. I never heard the word in my life. It is called a tundish in Lower Drumcondra, said Stephen, laughing, where they speak the best English. A tundish, said the Dean reflectively. That is a most interesting word. I must look that word up. Upon my word, I must. So we see two things here. One is that Stephen's concern with words, with language, with languages, and the role of English language on Stephen's psyche. So we'll come to his reflections very soon. On the next page, you see towards the bottom of the page, this is quite damning. The little word seemed to have turned a rapier point of his sensitiveness against this courteous and vigilant foe. He felt with a smart of dejection that the man to whom he was speaking was a countryman of Ben Jonson. Stephen has high esteem for Ben Jonson, the English dramatist, and he is very disappointed that this priest, even though he is a countryman of Ben Jonson, has so poor knowledge of English. The language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine. So Stephen and the priest, they are speaking in English language, which is not Stephen's language, it is the priest's language. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master on his lips and on mine. So the English speak or pronounce these words very differently, and when Stephen tries to pronounce them, they will be different because Stephen has an Irish accent. I cannot speak or write these words without unrest of spirit. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an awkward speech. So here the issue is that of linguistic domination. So the English who colonized Ireland not only dominated them politically but also linguistically, as they did with India, as they did with every colonized country, not only the English, the French also. So colonial domination would mean total domination, political, linguistic, cultural, economic, and therefore nationalist movements, they often go against the domination of the language of the colonizing power. Therefore, in Stephen's mind, there is an unrest, there is a conflict in his use of English, and whenever he uses English, he feels that this language dominates his culture. So the best way of taking revenge, as Stephen imagines in course of this chapter, is that by learning this language better than the English people themselves and creating great works of art. So that was what Joyce also did. So Joyce did not openly side with the Irish nationalist revival, but he used the English language in such a manner as to defeat the English in their own game. So his novels and and Ulysses, his greatest novel, they have created a mark on English language, and they have developed the English language in a way that even English authors could not come up to. His language so familiar and so foreign will always be an awkward speech. So that is, for example, for us Indians, mostly English is like the second language. It is an awkward language, or it is a foreign language which we try to learn. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds them at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language. And then the Dean continues with the conversation about art. And to distinguish between the beautiful and the sublime, the Dean added, to distinguish between moral beauty and material beauty, and to inquire what kind of beauty is proper to each of the various arts. These are some interesting points we might take up. So actually these points are taken up by Stephen, though not in a conversation with the Dean. Later in a conversation with his friend, he develops his aesthetic theory and takes up the issues about sublimity, beauty, and the different kinds of beauty or genres appropriate to different kinds of writing or different genres. We will stop here, because after this there will be a conversation with Cranley, and there will be dialogues with his friends. We will look at them in the next class.